I'm Tony Tremble, but you are the one who will tremble. Does that mean you're Tony? No, I'm Tony. Sorry, I made this confusing. Let's get to the stories. The spirit of William Wallace and the ancient Scottish swords. Before I start telling you this story, let me tell you a little about the location where it happened. We were exploring the Highlands in Scotland. We were a group of English tourists, and we had a guide with us. The whole thing was going to take about a week. We were going to touch every historical landmark in the region. As you might know, the Highlands are famous for their weather inclemency, so it was freezing and the wind was mean. But there we were, about to start a new adventure in a new place. I'd always been intrigued by the Highlands. I guess I can say Christopher Lambert's representation of a Highlander and then Mel Gibson's role in Braveheart were enough to convince me I had to see these places by myself. I could never imagine, though, that I was going to be so close to death during that trip. The fact that I'm telling you this is almost miraculous. I like to think the spirit of William Wallace or MacLeod was looking after me, but it might have just been good luck. Inverness was beautiful, but we left that morning with the sun shining bright over our sunglasses, carrying the world in our backpacks, and enjoying the road full of endless possibilities that opened before us. The first hike, I have to say, was quite hard. I'd never hiked in a place that was so rocky before, and I almost twisted my ankle more than once. Luckily, though, I had a couple of walking sticks with me. Those helped a lot. The itinerary of the trip I booked included sleeping in stone constructions from back in William's times or camping outside of them. The first night we slept inside. I was in complete awe. It was like living inside a book or a movie. Everything was perfect, just the way I saw it on the big screen. I fell asleep with a big smile on my face. By the third night, my body wanted nothing to do with the stony road again. Still, my smile wouldn't come out. Everything around me was movie-like, and I was enjoying it a lot. Well, that night's rest was going to prove very important because the following night was going to be sleepless and unforgettable. It all started when we arrived at a big stone construction that used to be the fortress of one of the Scottish clans back in the day. We couldn't sleep inside because it was a historical property, so we had tents set outside the castle for the night. Before we went to bed, though, we had a big dinner inside the fortress with wine and a hot meal to keep us warm. I noticed right away that the guy in charge of the place spoke funny, but I didn't want to ask, so I just smiled and carried on talking to my tour mates. The walls of the castle had ornaments that included swords and axes from another age. It was fascinating to see the huge swords, but it was also a little intimidating since they'd been used to protect the fortress and to kill English soldiers. I must admit, by the time I made it to my tent, I was a little dizzy from the wine. I noticed something strange in the way that the keeper of the castle greeted us, almost with disdain, but again I said nothing. As soon as I closed the zipper of my sleeping bag, I heard the first noises. They came from the fortress. It was the sound of metal against metal. Perhaps, I thought naively, he was doing the dishes. Half an hour later, just as I was starting to fade out into dreamland, I heard the creaking noise of the fortress's door and a few steps. I could swear someone was walking in our direction. The steps went around walking between each of the tents and then went back inside. I heard some more metal noises and the door creaked open again, but this time it wasn't just one person, but several people that made it out of the fortress. I was terrified. My internal alarm had gone off and my entire body was petrified by fear. I didn't know any of my tent mates so well as to wake them up. Perhaps I was being paranoid. I wasn't. We were in real danger. The first thing I heard were some words in a language that was completely strange to me, and the first couple of screams from the tent next to us woke all the camp up. I peeked outside through the zipper and saw 3 men dressed in their Scottish kilt with swords and the body painted like William Wallace cutting through the tent. They were cutting through the fabric to get to the people inside. Luckily for us, the swords were too big and old, so they were barely cutting through anything. The tour guide screamed to run into the forest, and so we did, while being chased by the people swinging the ancient swords. The soil was wet, and I was only wearing socks. I was shivering cold, half wet, and terrified, but I kept on running until the guide reunited us all in a clear spot 10 minutes away from the campsite. We were all cold, and I thought there was a real chance of getting hypothermia. We needed to get somewhere where we could get warm, or we were going to freeze to death. The Highlands are not for the faint of heart or those who suffer cold too much. The guide led us to a safe spot, lit up a huge fire, and we waited until sunrise, warming each other next to the flames. I was still in shock at what happened. As soon as we could, we went back to the road where we called for help. The Scottish police arrested the occupants of the fortress, who ended up being committed to a mental institution. When the patrol arrived, they were speaking in ancient Gaelic, repeating non-stop that they were direct descendants of William Wallace and that the English should pay for what they did. We were very lucky that night because nobody got hurt, but it could have been a catastrophe. I like to think it was William's spirit that protected us from the wrath of those irrational people fighting an ancient war against innocent tourists. The Storm in the Cave. It was a long time ago. Tina and Nick were still children. They're in college now. I had a busy job in the city that was especially heavy during the summer months. They wanted desperately to go on vacation, but I couldn't just leave. We came to an agreement. They would go camping full-time at the nearest camping site, which is just outside the forest, and I would stay with them from Thursday to Monday. In fact, that was the first strange thing about that night. It was a Tuesday. I remember it perfectly. I have no idea why I was there on a Tuesday, but thank God I was there. We were having a barbecue close to the tent. The children were playing, and Rose was trying to find something on the radio that wasn't the news. Suddenly, I overheard, "Strong storms predicted for tonight with a thunderstorm fast approaching. If you're outdoors, take precautions. You're listening to KQRC Radio." Rose looked at me and said, "Did you hear that? Maybe we shouldn't stay here." To be honest with you, I made the mistake of dismissing the weather report just because the sky was full of shining stars as far as the eye could see. Well, as far as the forest anyways. The forest had always been a mystery to me. Rose and I both grew up very close. We'd been to that camping site a million times before, but that forest never stopped intimidating me. But back to that night. There was some thunder afar, but I thought nothing to worry about. We went to bed with a full stomach and a big smile, but woke up to the tent moving as if 5 giants from prehistoric ages were rocking us to sleep. I opened the main zipper timidly just to feel wild, violent gusts of wind moving a curtain of rain around. Tina looked at me and I could clearly see terror in her eyes. Suddenly, one of the tent stakes flew away and we heard the cracking noise of a tree near us. We all got into our waterproof clothes and ventured into the forest. The tent wasn't safe anymore. It felt like we could be crushed in any second. The forest's vegetation was thick and lush because it was summer. Everything was green. Although the wind was beating against the leaves, we could feel it less while walking through the trees. Eventually, we found shelter. The whole family stayed together behind a huge rock covered in moss that blocked the wind. Soon, we improvised a tiny tent with some sticks and some bigger leaves we found around, and the rain was no longer pouring on us heavily. It felt great to be safe and together on such a harsh night. Suddenly, the whole thing came down and we ended up being soaking wet. We had to move on. The little tent wasn't a solution. I lit up my flashlight and we walked under the storm until we found a small cave inside the forest. The rock was big and hollow and formed a natural roof. Everything under it was completely dry. We found our spot, I thought. We ran in and soon enough had a fire going with some dry branches and a couple of logs we found around. We could see the place a little better and, although I noticed some inscriptions on the stone, I thought it was just vandals that spent the night there. The rain was still pouring. With the warmth of the fire, we managed to dry our clothes. The kids were falling asleep and so were we. I didn't want to, though. I didn't know what or who was in that cave with us. I had the feeling we were not alone. I had the feeling we were being observed. I looked everywhere and I couldn't find anything, not a single silhouette in the pitch black dark. I don't know when it was exactly that I fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of steps coming our way. They were heavy steps, and I could hear a little snarl followed by a slight moan and heavy respiration. I managed to peep through one eye, and I saw a brown bear walking towards us. I struggled to remember, are brown bears less dangerous? Is that a brown bear or a grizzly? My mind was as chaotic as the weather. Several little bears were walking behind it, and they were coming in our direction. I had to decide, fast. If we ran, surely the bear would catch and eat us. But maybe if we stayed very still, the bear wouldn't notice our presence and leave. We had absolutely no chance of fighting against a bear that might have weighed a ton, at least. I held Rose's hand. She had Tina on her while little Nick was sleeping over me. It was as if we understood each other, ethereally, without even speaking. I guess our connection was the instinct to protect our children. We stayed there, petrified, until we heard the big bear walking into the forest. We waited for about 40 more minutes until the sun came up and rushed our way back to the campsite. To our surprise, the tent was destroyed. A huge branch had fallen over it. If we didn't make it out fast, we would be counted among the fatal victims of one of the biggest storms to ever hit our region. We escaped death twice in the same night. It was time to go back home. Needless to say, the children never realized anything and were pouting as we were picking up the remains of our nomad residents. The forest hides secrets, I'm sure of that, but it also hides real menaces that could end your life with a mere blow. Oh, one more thing. Always follow the advice of the weather forecast when camping. I'm sorry, wherever you are. Okay, this is quite a recent story. It happened only a couple of summers ago, but it seems as if I've been carrying this burden forever. Sometimes the memory feels like the load on my shoulders is too heavy. This is the first time I'm telling this story to anyone outside my family. We were camping out in the woods. I grew up surrounded by 22 cousins. You heard me right. We were such a big gang that we thought of ourselves as invincible and would get into all kinds of problems. One of those problems was sneaking out of our homes and going alone to meet each other in the woods at night. I'm talking about the deep forest where we knew our parents couldn't reach us. It was the ultimate adventure. We could hear every noise in the woods at night, and the feeling of danger mixed with the adrenaline of being away from our parents was uncanny. But this time, I was with my friend Valerie, just the two of us. She'd just been through a very difficult time. She lost her mom 3 years ago, so back then it had just happened a year ago. I thought some fresh air would help her clear up her head. Since I'd spent practically my entire life in the woods, I wasn't afraid. I was a member of the Invincible team, but this time we weren't 22 cousins, only 2. Before anything happened, we were very happy listening to Alanis Morissette and screaming the lyrics as we drove through the magic scenery surrounding the forest. We were going into the wild and coming back to a fresh start. Well, that was the idea, but instead, what I got was this awful memory that hurts every time it comes to my mind. But back to the moment it all happened. We'd gone there for a week and were entering day 3. The previous 2 nights we sat by the fire and talked until we couldn't stay awake anymore. Then we would go to sleep with a smile and say goodbye to the black velvet full of silverware that greeted us every night. I was about to find out night 3 wasn't going to be like the other nights. We were already inside my tent when I heard it. The sound was of a fight, 2 people screaming at each other. It came from not so far from our tent. I heard some footsteps and a loud thump with a slight moan or scream. After that, everything went silent again. Valerie was sleeping, and I guess she didn't hear anything the 3rd night. By the time night 4 came along, I was already a little paranoid, I have to admit it. We went to bed after our long talk again, and I went into my sleeping bag thinking about the noises from the night before. I had no idea what was about to happen though. The noise that night wasn't a thump, but a gunshot. The gunshot wasn't the scariest part. 1 minute after hearing the explosion, I started smelling gunpowder. My entire body got into an alert position, and I stood up inside the tiny tent, which resulted in me falling over Valerie and waking her up. I asked if she could smell anything, but she said no multiple times. Have I gone mad, I thought? But no, I was nowhere near being mad. I tried the entire 5th day to convince Valerie to back off without telling her what had happened the previous 2 nights. The whole idea was to be there to escape a traumatic event, so I didn't want to generate another one for her. Regardless of how obvious I was, she was enjoying herself. The daily hikes and the fresh air kept her mind from going into dark thoughts about death. So I just gave up and decided to hold it together to help my friend. After all, it had all been noises away from us until then. By the time the 5th night fell upon us, I skipped the nightly chat and went to bed early, saying I was a little sick in the stomach. It was the perfect excuse to leave the next day, but night 5 was about to change all my plans. It must have been a couple of hours after I fell asleep. I woke up to a man's voice screaming some indistinct insults to somebody else. That somebody else was also screaming at him, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, I started hearing footsteps, fast ones, as if someone was running toward our tent. That's when I got really scared. It was the voice of a woman. She came straight to our tent and started screaming for help. She said, "You have to let me in." Valerie was awake and she shook her head asking me not to open the tent. I felt sorry for the woman outside. She seemed to be in a lot of trouble. The woman kept calling us names for not opening the tent, but then said, "Oh no," and ran away. We heard another set of steps going her way. We held hands inside the tent, looking straight into each other's eyes. It all ended with the loud sound of 2 gunshots coming from the direction where the couple ran. The smell of gunpowder filled my nose, and I was sure we had just been witness to a murder. We were waiting for him to come for us. We waited and waited in vain because the entire night went by and none of them came back. The next morning, we packed everything in silence as if we were androids instead of humans. The ride home was completely silent, and we haven't spoken ever since. Although nothing came out in the news and I have no idea of what happened that night, I can't help but feel guilty for not letting her in, for not even trying. I have no idea how Valerie must feel, but I just hope that by telling it, this memory will stop hurting so much. Every night I hear her "oh no" in my head over and over again until I fall asleep. Wherever you are, whoever you are, I'm sorry.